In the spring of 1832, a preacher named Samuel Cormack rode hard through a forgotten patch of Alabama wilderness known as Pine Hollow. The fog was so thick it seemed to bleed from the earth itself, clinging to the hooves of his horse and the hem of his coat. His breath came in shallow bursts. He wasn't running from anything, at least not anything you could see. He was on his way to speak at a chapel he'd never been to before, led by a family he'd only heard about in whispers, the Dunleaves. But halfway down the muddy road that cut through the pine woods, the horse bucked violently and refused to go any further. It let out a cry, not of pain, but of dread, primal, ancient, the kind of sound that makes the birds go silent. Cormack dismounted, heart racing, and followed a trail of crushed leaves and broken twigs that led into the woods. Something had disturbed the land, and then he saw it. A grave, shallow, fresh. No marker, no cross, just a mound of raw soil, damp and sunken. And then the soil moved. Cormack stumbled back. A small hand, pale and trembling, emerged from the earth like a vine reaching for light. Fingers, blackened with dirt, clawed the air as faint choking sounds rose up beneath them. He ran. He didn't speak. He didn't bury the child or alert the town. He rode until his voice was gone and his sanity frayed. But he did leave one message, scratched into the back wall of a barn 10 miles west of the site. They bury them breathing. Before we uncover what happened in Pine Hollow, I need you to do something. If you're drawn to stories the history books refuse to print, if you believe that some horrors are buried not just under dirt, but under silence, then, like this video, subscribe to the channel, share it with someone who doesn't believe in evil, and hit the bell so you never miss what crawls up next. Now, let's return to the grave that should have never been dug. Pine Hollow. Alabama was the kind of place that didn't exist on most maps. It sat at the convergence of 3 dirt roads and 2 forgotten rail lines, surrounded on all sides by pine trees that grew so tall and so close together they seemed to lean in when you passed beneath them, like they were listening. The Dunleave family had been its founders, its shepherds, and some said its executioners. They ran the church. They ran the funeral home. They built the caskets and dug the graves. They conducted weddings, sermons, baptisms, and burials, all on the same acre of land. Elias Dunleave was the patriarch, a towering man with a silver beard and a voice like burnt oak. His sermons weren't shouted. They were whispered, yet they filled the room like smoke. His wife, Temperance, played the organ. Their children, Levi, Miriam, Ezekiel, and Ruth, served as altar assistants, coffin carriers, and occasionally pallbearers. They wore black even in summer. They rarely smiled, and none of them ever left Pine Hollow. To the outside world, they were simply devout, but to the locals, they were something else. In Pine Hollow, salvation wasn't something you prayed for. It was something you earned, and the price was high. Elias Dunleave preached that true faith could not be declared with words. It had to be proven, with silence, with stillness, with the willingness to suffer as Christ had suffered, to die, not symbolically, but momentarily, to enter the grave alive and rise again. He called it the chamber of proving. Most thought it metaphorical, a parable. But rumors began to spread, quiet, bitter rumors, that some families had been asked to bury their loved ones before they were dead. A test of faith, Elias would say, brings breath back to the faithful. But only the Dunleaves knew who returned and who didn't. On March 19, 1832, a widow named Elsie Maynard brought her 12-year-old son Thomas to the Dunleaves' chapel. He had been sick for weeks, some sort of fever, burning, raving, coughing blood. Doctors said there was no cure, no hope. But Elias said otherwise. He offered to take Thomas into the church's sanctuary beneath, a holy place where faith could undo death. No one else was permitted to enter. 3 days passed. On the 4th, Elias emerged alone. "Your boy has been received," he told Elsie. "He walks now with the breath of God." But he would not let her see him. No funeral, no grave, no proof. Just a sealed coffin and the promise that her son had transcended. She wailed, clawed at the church doors. They escorted her home. She died by the river that night, her face turned toward the church windows, mouth still open in a scream. Others came. Others disappeared. The Dunleaves logged every burial, every sermon, every soul taken into the fold. But no outsiders were allowed to witness the rites. They promised salvation. They delivered silence. And silence in Pine Hollow wasn't empty. It breathed. A new man would arrive 2 weeks later. Marshal Abram Keller. Scarred by war, abandoned by faith, and skeptical of anything wrapped in Scripture. He was looking into missing persons, 3 to be exact, all last seen entering the Dunleaves' chapel. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that beneath the floorboards of that quiet, pine-framed church was something older than any sermon. A tradition passed down not by blood, but by burial. And that in the cellar, 7 coffins were already waiting. 6 were filled. 1 was not. Marshal Abram Keller had arrived in Pine Hollow with nothing but a horse, a warrant, and a long memory of what lies men tell when draped in cloth and crowned with crosses. He'd seen it before. Righteous men with bloodied hands and Scripture on their lips. But something about the Dunleaves was different. The fear in the townspeople's eyes wasn't ordinary, it was reverent, like they feared not for their lives but for their souls. The first thing Keller noticed was how quiet the town was. Children didn't play in the streets. No dogs barked. Doors closed slowly when he passed, as if guided by invisible hands. He stopped at the general store where a woman named Agnes barely met his gaze as she sold him a canteen and a loaf of dense black bread. When he asked her about the missing persons, she only muttered, "You won't find them unless they want to be found." Keller pressed further. They were last seen at the Dunleave Chapel. Agnes froze. Her hands trembled slightly as she wrapped the bread in butcher paper. "Then they're in the fold now," she whispered. "Like my sister. Like the baker's boy. Like Reverend Harrow." "What do you mean, in the fold?" Agnes looked up at him, her eyes glossy. "We all got our place, mister. Some above, some below." That night, Keller visited the chapel. It stood at the edge of a dense pine forest, its wood bleached gray by sun and storms. It had no steeple, no bell, only a crude cross carved into the wooden door and a thin wisp of smoke rising from its chimney. He knocked once. The door opened before he could knock again. Elias Dunleave stood in the doorway, lantern in hand. He was taller than Keller expected, thin but not frail. His eyes were deep-set and clear, like 2 coins at the bottom of a well. "Marshal," Elias said softly, "the Lord must be watching over us if he sent you here." "I'm looking into disappearances," Keller said. 3 names, James Holloway, Ruth Minter, Isaac Ford, all last seen walking through that door. Elias stepped aside. "Then let us speak of it. Not outside, where the night can twist words. Come in, my family will fix you something." Keller hesitated, then stepped inside. The interior of the chapel was plain. Wooden benches, an altar of stone, and walls covered in faded paintings. Biblical scenes, but altered. In one, Abraham raised a knife over Isaac, not in fear, but in celebration. In another, Lazarus crawled from the grave with empty sockets where his eyes should be. Temperance. Dunleave greeted him with a soft smile and a cup of steaming broth. Her hair was bound in white cloth, her hands soft and cold. The children remained silent, seated in a row at the back of the chapel. Each of them watched Cellar with the stillness of carved saints. "I'd like to question your family," Cellar said, sipping the broth. "Separately." Elias nodded. "Of course. But first, would you allow me the honor of showing you where we bury our dead? It may help you understand." "I didn't say they were dead." Elias smiled. "No, you didn't." They walked behind the chapel, lanterns casting long shadows across the graves. There were dozens, some with names etched neatly into stone, others marked only with wooden stakes. One had a child's doll tied to it with frayed ribbon. Another had no marker at all. Elias stopped before a larger stone near the edge of the cemetery. "This is Reverend Harrow's grave. He was my teacher, a great man, but he lacked conviction in the end." Cellar raised an eyebrow. "Conviction?" "Faith must be tested," Elias said. "As fire tests iron, so must death test belief." Cellar crouched beside the grave. The soil looked recently disturbed. He touched it, still loose. "And what if that test is fatal?" "Then they were never meant to rise," Elias whispered. Cellar stood. "I'll be exhuming this one, first thing in the morning." Elias didn't flinch. "Then may the Lord guide your shovel." Back at the boarding house, Cellar reviewed his notes. The 3 missing persons had come here under different pretenses, one to marry, one to bury a parent, and one to seek a miracle for a dying child. All had been drawn to the Dunleaves' promise. Salvation through surrender. Life through death. He barely slept. At dawn, he returned to the grave with a shovel. The ground came apart too easily. It hadn't settled at all. 3 feet down, the shovel struck wood. 4 feet, he cleared the dirt. It wasn't a coffin. It was a box, crudely nailed, thin as a drawer, with air holes drilled into the sides. He pried it open. Empty. No bones, no remains, only scratch marks, deep ones. Some were fingernail-sized, others weren't. He leaned in, shining his lantern. Inside, etched into the wood in shaky, blood-tinted letters, was a phrase. "I believed. I was not enough." Cellar stood, staring at the open box as the first light of morning spilled through the pines. Then he heard it. A hum. Faint. Female. Coming from beneath his boots. He dropped to his knees, pressed his ear to the soil. It wasn't the wind. It was singing. A slow, mournful melody rising from below the grave. He looked back toward the chapel. The children were standing at the window, watching him. Smiling. Marshal Abram Cellar returned to the boarding house with dirt under his nails and a tremor in his hands. He hadn't spoken a word since digging up that box, or whatever twisted parody of a coffin it was. He kept hearing the song, that humming, sorrowful cadence rising from the soil. It clung to him like the morning mist, slipping beneath the collar of his coat and pooling in the hollows of his chest. He skipped breakfast, skipped coffee, skipped the polite greetings from townsfolk who had stopped pretending not to see him. Instead, he made straight for the town records. There was no courthouse, only a single-room building with peeling blue paint and a rusted lock that broke with one twist of his knife. Inside, the smell of mildew and dust clung to rows of parchment and leather-bound ledgers. He flipped open the burial registry and immediately something felt wrong. The handwriting was the same on every page. From 1811 to 1832, every death had been recorded by a single hand. Precise, sharp, and neat, even the entries written last month looked no different from the ones written 20 years ago. He counted the names. Over 200. Most had been marked with a small cross beside them, but 47 had a different symbol, a single black circle, drawn beside the names as if sealing them shut. Keller turned to the last marked entry. Ruth Minter, age 19, circle. She was one of the 3 missing people he'd been sent to find. The record claimed she'd been received into the fold. No date of death, no cause, just that phrase. Beneath it, someone had scrawled a single line in slanted script, returned not by breath, but by silence. He didn't know what it meant, but it sent a ripple of nausea through his spine. He turned to the ledger on marriages, then baptisms, all the same hand, all names that matched the gravestones behind the chapel. He flipped through pages until one name stopped him cold. Thomas Maynard, age 12, received into the fold. Mother, Elsie Maynard, outcome, risen. But the name had been crossed out. And beside it, in dark ink, voice broken, returned to rest. His blood chilled. He slammed the book shut. As he left the record room, he nearly collided with the youngest Dunleave girl, Ruth. Not the missing Ruth Minter, but Ruth Dunleave, the preacher's daughter. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old, pale as chalk, eyes the color of cold steel. "You're in the wrong place," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. He crouched slightly to her level. "And where would the right place be, little one?" She pointed toward the chapel. "Below." Then she smiled and walked away. Keller didn't follow. Not yet. Instead, he visited the old well behind the smithy, where a former gravedigger named Horace Mallory was said to sleep off his whiskey. The man was brittle and hollow, his skin like old bark and his eyes always squinting, even when there was no sun. Keller bought him a bottle and asked about the Dunleaves. "They didn't always bury them alive," Horace muttered. "Used to be they just prayed, like normal folks. Then Elias went into the woods one night, alone. Came back with mud on his hands and scripture in a language no one had heard. What changed? They stopped asking for death certificates, for one." Horace took a long pull from the bottle and wiped his mouth. "He told us the grave was a gate, that the dead could choose to stay or come back, if they were worthy, but that's not what happened." "What did happen?" Horace's hand shook as he pointed to the church. "Some came back wrong, eyes open but not seeing, mouths stitched inside with something black. They wouldn't talk, wouldn't eat, just hummed, like bees in a jar. Why didn't anyone stop it? We tried, once. Sheriff Tanner and a few others. Went to the chapel, said they'd burn it down if Elias didn't stop. What happened to them?" Horace's voice dropped to a wheeze. "They're still buried out there. Only thing is, their graves breathe." Keller left the old man sitting in the grass, rocking slightly. The sun was low when he reached the chapel again. Evening services had begun. This time, Keller didn't knock. He walked straight through the front door and stood at the back of the room. The congregation didn't turn to look. They just kept singing, a slow melodic chant in a tongue Keller couldn't place. The children sang louder than the adults, their voices high and thin. At the altar stood Elias Dunleave, arms outstretched, eyes closed. Behind him, the stone wall was lit with candles. Keller's eyes scanned the room. The pews were filled with townspeople, many of whom matched names he'd seen in the death ledger. He stepped forward. "I have questions." The singing stopped. Elias opened his eyes and smiled gently. "Marshal Keller, you've come to listen. I've come to see what's beneath this chapel." A few people gasped. Temperance Dunleavy stood quickly, her face gone white. The children did not move. "Faith has no need for desecration," Elias said. "If your heart is true, you'll see what lies below in time." "I'm not waiting," Keller said. "Where's Ruth Minter? Where are the others?" Elias walked down from the altar slowly, stopping just inches from Keller. He smelled of pine sap and damp stone. "Do you believe in resurrection?" he asked. "I believe in justice." Elias tilted his head. "They are not so different." He motioned toward the altar. Keller hesitated, then moved forward. Elias stepped behind the altar and pressed his hand to the wall. A section of stone groaned, then slid open. A staircase descended into blackness. "You seek the truth," Elias said. "Then follow it downward." Keller drew his pistol. "If I see anything that screams, I shoot." Elias only nodded. "That is your right," and Keller stepped into the dark. The stone steps descended at an angle so steep that Keller had to brace himself against the wall to keep from slipping. The air thickened as he went down, moist, stale, and heavy with something he couldn't name. Not rot, not mildew, something older, more organic, like the smell of earth that had never known sunlight. Behind him, the stone wall slid shut with a slow, grinding finality. Darkness. Only the faint glow of his lantern remained, casting flickering shadows on the stone corridor that unfurled before him. Carvings lined the walls. Primitive symbols, circles within circles, rough-hewn shapes of open mouths and closed eyes. None resembled Christian iconography. There were no crosses, no doves, just mouths and eyes and silence. He moved slowly. At first it was quiet, not the peaceful quiet of a sanctuary, but a waiting kind of silence, pregnant, expectant. Then, beneath his boots, the stone floor shifted, no longer solid but soft in patches. He knelt and ran his hand across the surface. Carpet? No, not fabric. Hair, human hair, long tangled strands embedded into the mortar like it had grown from the stone itself. He didn't flinch, not visibly, but his hand stayed close to the pistol on his belt. Deeper he went. After what felt like half an hour, the corridor opened into a vast chamber lit by tall, narrow candles wedged into skulls. Dozens of them. Human, animal, some with too many teeth, others with none. The wax had melted over the bone like tears. In the center of the chamber was a large wooden table, and on it, 6 chairs, each carved from dark mahogany, each slightly different. One with antlers for legs, another with twisted rope for arms. Each bore a nameplate. He read them aloud. Thomas Maynard, Isaac Ford, Ruth Minter, Ezekiel Dunleavy, Sheriff Tanner, Reverend Harrow. But only 5 chairs were occupied. The figures in them sat upright, arms folded across their chests. Eyes closed, faces pale, lips stitched shut with thin black thread. Yet none appeared decayed. They were preserved, almost lifelike, like dolls awaiting a command. Keller approached Ruth Minter's chair. Her hair was still braided neatly. Her hands clutched a small leather-bound book. When he tried to pry it free, her eyes shot open. White, fully white. She did not move otherwise. No sound, just the terrible, endless hum vibrating in her throat behind her sealed lips. Keller backed away, nearly knocking over one of the skull candles. He spun as footsteps echoed from the tunnel behind him. Elias. But he wasn't alone. The entire Dunleavy family stood behind him. Elias, Temperance, Levi, Miriam, and little Ruth, all dressed in black, hands clasped, faces serene. "This is the fold," Elias said softly. "Those who believed, those who were tested, and those who failed to rise." "You buried them alive," Keller said, voice low with rage. "You drugged them, sealed them in boxes, stitched their mouths shut. You call that faith?" "They volunteered," Temperance whispered. "Each of them prayed for proof, for transformation." "They begged for breath," Keller snapped. "I saw the scratch marks." "Because they were still clinging to the flesh," Elias said, "and the flesh must be broken before the spirit can rise." Keller raised his pistol. "I'm taking them, all of them. Every last one of these people is evidence." "They are not people anymore," Elias said. "They are vessels." Keller fired a warning shot into the stone floor. It echoed through the chamber like a thunderclap. The seated figures did not move, but the sixth chair, the empty one, began to creak. Slowly, deliberately, as if something unseen had just sat down. Keller turned. The chair now bore a new nameplate, carved crudely but unmistakably. Abram Keller. He stared at it, pulse racing. "No," he muttered. "No, you think this scares me. You think this is salvation." "It is not fear," Elias said. "It is surrender. You won't get me to kneel." "We don't ask you to kneel," Temperance said. Then Keller felt it, something behind him. Breathing. Wet, shallow, rhythmic. He spun, but nothing was there. The lantern flickered. And then the singing began. From the walls, from the floor, from the mouths of the stitched. A low, endless hum that rose like a swarm of bees trapped in glass. He fired again. At the ceiling, at the chairs, at the sound. It didn't stop. He ran. Down another corridor deeper into the earth. Candles blew out behind him as he passed. The air grew colder, thicker, until it wasn't air anymore. It was breath. 100 lungs exhaling in unison. He stumbled into a narrow chamber. Smaller, circular. At its center, a pit, lined with mirrors. Above it, carved into the stone, a message: "Only through burial is the self shed." He backed away, but the Dunleaves were already there, standing at the chamber's entrance. "You're not the first to run," Elias said, "but you may be the last." "I've got more bullets." Elias nodded. "So did the others." Keller leveled his gun. Elias raised a hand, and the walls began to sing, not hum. Sing. Voices layered atop each other, tones that weren't human, a harmony of grief and devotion and something far older than scripture. Keller covered his ears. But it was inside him now. The music, the memory, the image of a box in the earth. The lid nailed shut, the soil pressing down, the breath running out. He dropped to his knees. The pistol clattered. "You don't have to be afraid," Elias said. Keller looked up. "I'm not afraid," he said. "I'm angry." Then the wall behind Elias cracked, splintered, and from it emerged a hand, pale, stitched, trembling. Not Elias's, not any Dunleaves. It was Ruth Minter. She was crawling from the stone, from the wall itself, and her mouth had come undone. Ruth Minter's mouth tore open with a wet rip, black thread dangling like snapped spider silk. Her lips were dry and cracked, but her eyes, pure white only moments ago, had turned glassy with terror. Not rage, not possession, terror. She fell to her knees, gasping for air that had eluded her for who knows how long. Her hands clawed at her throat, and her voice came out in fragments, hoarse and breaking like dried leaves. "Help, please, help." Elias didn't move. Temperance closed her eyes and began humming again, that same old tune that seemed to echo from nowhere and everywhere at once. Keller lunged toward Ruth and pulled her away from the wall, shielding her behind his arm. "Get away from her," he barked. "She chose the fold," Elias said solemnly. "Her suffering is the price of doubt." "She didn't choose anything," Keller snarled. "She was a child." "She was 19, Temperance whispered, her voice soft and cold as winter soil. "She came to us with grief in her belly and hope in her eyes. She begged to be made whole." Keller looked down at Ruth, her frail frame trembling, tears streaking through layers of candle soot and dust. She shook her head violently. "I didn't know what it meant," she whispered. "They told me I'd see my sister again." "You were tricked," Keller said, then turned toward Elias. "What did you show her? What did you do to make these people believe you?" Elias raised both hands. "Nothing. I showed them only what already lived in them: grief, longing, desperation. They asked to be brought to the edge. We merely provided the shovel." Ruth coughed. "They buried me alive." Keller helped her to her feet and guided her slowly toward the stone tunnel. "You're going to answer for this," he told Elias. "You're all going to hang." "No one in this town will hang us," Elias replied. "They've already joined us, and soon, so will you." Keller didn't respond. He gripped Ruth tighter and led her into the tunnel, pistol drawn, lantern in hand. As they walked, the humming receded, slowly, like a tide pulling back from the shore. But the deeper they moved into the passage, the more twisted the walls became. No longer smooth stone, but ribbed and uneven, like the inside of a throat. "It changes down here," Ruth whispered, still clinging to his coat. "It's never the same way twice. You've been down here before?" "I was in a box," she said. "I heard the singing through the dirt. Then the box opened and hands pulled me out. They were wrong. Too many fingers." Keller said nothing, but his grip on the lantern tightened. Up ahead, a fork in the tunnel. To the left, a faint breeze and flickering light. To the right, silence. And something else, heat. He chose the left. The passage narrowed and turned, then opened into a smaller chamber. Inside were shelves, dozens of them, carved into the walls like a grotesque library. And on each shelf, boxes. Coffin-sized, wooden, many with symbols carved into the lids. Circles, crosses with inverted stems, stylized mouths. Some had chains, others were sealed with wax. Keller stepped closer. Inside one box, the wood had split just enough to reveal a shriveled hand, fingers curled into a claw. Another box had scratch marks on the inside of the glass viewing panel, deep gouges, desperate. He turned to Ruth. "Are these?" "Yes," she said. "They're waiting." "For what?" "For someone to listen." A loud click echoed through the chamber. Keller spun around, pistol raised. Elias stood at the threshold of the chamber. "You've seen it now," Elias said, "and you still carry the burden of anger. It's a shame." "This ends tonight," Keller snapped. "I'm burning this whole place." Elias tilted his head. "Marshall," he said gently, "have you ever lost someone?" Keller's lips tightened. His jaw twitched. "I have," Elias continued. "My brother, my son, my own father. I was promised salvation through prayer, but all I received was silence. Then I found the fold, a way to hear the ones left behind, even if only for a moment. You buried people for closure? No, Elias said. I buried them for clarity, to remove the veil between here and beyond. Not everyone returns, only those with unfinished songs. You're insane. Elias stepped inside the chamber and touched one of the boxes. You say that, yet you came here chasing ghosts, and now you stand among them. The ground trembled. Ruth whimpered and backed into a corner. The boxes began to rattle. Softly at first, then violently. The humming returned, louder than before. It poured from the walls, the floor, even from inside Keller's own skull. He pressed his hands to his ears, but it didn't help. A box near the far wall split open. A figure emerged, thin, bone-white, with black thread still dangling from its jaw. It didn't speak, it only watched. More boxes cracked. More eyes opened. Keller grabbed Ruth and pulled her down a narrow exit corridor. He didn't know where it led, but anywhere was better than here. Behind them, the walls pulsed with sound and light, a candlelit riot of the dead. The tunnel curved downward again, and then they came upon it. A door, large, metal, sealed with 3 wooden beams. Carved into the steel was a phrase, "To the place where no name is spoken." Keller didn't want to open it. But behind them, the tunnel was flooding with light and singing. He raised his boot and kicked the beam loose, then another, then the third. The door groaned open. Beyond it was blackness, but not empty, cold, wet, alive. Ruth froze. "No," she whispered. "Not here, not this room." Keller looked at her. "What is this?" She didn't answer, because behind them Elias had entered the corridor, smiling. "You've come to the heart," he said. "The fold welcomes you." Then Keller saw what lay just beyond the doorway. A pit. A deep, round pit, lined with mirrors and filled with water so still it looked like glass. On its edge sat 6 small stools, each carved with a name, each already occupied. 6 people, unmoving, eyes open, watching their reflections, singing through stitched mouths. Only one stool remained empty. It bore his name. It began with the shaking of his limbs, subtle at first, like a chill. Keller blinked, and for a moment the image in the water was no longer a reflection, but a memory. He was 10, holding his brother's hand in the fading light of the mine shaft, breathless, screaming for help that never came. A voice had whispered to him then, soft and low, "Let him go. Only one can rise." He had refused. He'd kept holding on, but the rocks caved in anyway. Now, in the chamber beneath the earth, that same voice returned. Clearer, older. The fold remembers all who called out and were denied. Keller stumbled back from the edge of the water. His muscles felt like they were filled with ash. Heavy, hollow. His eyes darted to Ruth, still rocking, still whispering her mantra like a prayer, her back turned to the pit. Her refusal was the only thing keeping her sane. "I won't listen," she muttered. "I won't listen, I won't listen." Elias stood on the other side of the chamber now, hands clasped like he was observing a baptism. "The reflection only shows the truth," he said calmly. "The question is whether the truth can be born." Keller clenched his fists, grounding himself. "You do this to broken people." "No," Elias replied. "We offer broken people the chance to be whole." He gestured toward the 6th figure, now slumped over on its stool, red threads spilling from its lips like ribbons. "Her song is over," Elias said. "She has gone where the fold cannot reach, unless—" He looked at Keller. "You take her place." Keller's jaw tightened. "Why me?" "Because you've already buried yourself in anger. You've carried the weight of guilt as if it were armor, but it isn't armor, it's your coffin." He stepped closer to the stool. "The fold doesn't demand perfection. It demands surrender." Keller's breath was shallow. His ears rang with that faint, familiar hum. The room felt closer now, the air thicker. The singing hadn't resumed, but it pulsed in the very stone. Then came the knock. 3 knocks. From the other side of the sealed stone wall. Keller turned. Knock, knock, knock. Ruth gasped and covered her ears. "It's back! It's back! It's trying to come through!" Keller grabbed her shoulder. "Who?" She looked up, eyes red and hollow. "My sister," she whispered. "But it's not her anymore." The stone behind them began to fracture. Not break, fracture, like skin tearing instead of rock. Black moisture oozed from the cracks, and through them, fingers. Thin, too long, writhing. Then a mouth, stitched, but smiling. Keller shoved Ruth behind him. The thing, whatever it was, pushed farther through the wall. Half its face emerged, pale and glistening. Its head twisted, bones crackling unnaturally until its chin touched its shoulder. And it began to sing. Not like the others. Not a hum or chant, but a lullaby. The same lullaby Keller's mother used to sing when the mine was too loud to sleep through. His knees buckled. "No," he whispered. "No, not this." But the voice grew louder. Sweet, familiar, forgiving. Elias was weeping now, joyfully. "She's coming," he said. "She's heard the empty place and answered it." Keller tried to stand. The song held him like a rope around the chest. The voice whispered now, inside his skull, "You never left me. You only buried me in silence." He saw it again. The mine collapse. His brother's bloodied hand. The weight of earth, the helplessness. He screamed, but it wasn't rage this time. It was grief. Real, naked grief. Ruth crawled toward him, tugging on his arm. "You have to fight it. You can't listen. That voice, it's not your brother. It's what's beneath him." Keller looked at her, and in that instant saw what they had taken from her. Not just years. Her anchor. Her sense of self. He gritted his teeth, pushing the voice back, word by word. No. The mouth in the wall stopped singing. The fingers tensed. And then, one by one, the remaining singers began to shake. Their songs fell apart. Off-key. Unstable. The pit water rippled violently. The mirrors shattered. Keller pulled Ruth to her feet. "We're leaving, now." "But the tunnel," she cried. "I don't care. I'll make one." He aimed his boot at the thinnest part of the wall and kicked with everything he had. Stone cracked, again. And again. The fingers behind them screeched, clawing at the floor. Elias shouted, "You don't understand. You break the fold, and the voice is free." Keller roared as he kicked the wall one last time. And it gave. Stone split. Sunlight. Not much, but enough to show the exit into a narrow shaft above, lined with roots and crumbling wood. The original burial tunnel. He hoisted Ruth upward. "Climb," he barked. She didn't hesitate. He followed, scraping his hands on the jagged walls, dirt falling into his mouth and eyes. Below, the lullaby rose again. Distorted now. Corrupted. The thing had entered the pit, and it was laughing. By the time Keller reached the top, his boots barely cleared the opening before the tunnel collapsed in on itself, choking the light and sound. They lay on the cold forest floor, panting, covered in dirt, alive. Above them, trees rustled. The sun was rising. Keller stared at the cracked ground where the exit had been. No chapel, no graves, just a flat circle of dead grass and scorched roots. He didn't speak. Ruth was the first to move. She pulled out a small scrap of cloth from her coat pocket, black thread still tangled inside. "I never left," she whispered. "It just stopped calling me." Keller took the thread, held it for a long moment, and let the wind carry it away. Behind them, the forest was silent, but in the breeze, a melody lingered, faint, insistent, as if something was still listening. 3 days later, the town of Fletcher's Cross looked almost unchanged. Porches still swept, horses still fed, the white chapel still standing like a monument to quiet piety. But for Keller, it was like waking in a house that had already burned down. The ashes were gone, but the smell lingered. He and Ruth had walked 12 miles north before finding a wagon. They hadn't said much. What could they say? How do you put into words the sound of a voice that came from beneath stone, that knew your name before you spoke it, that hummed lullabies from the grave? They arrived at the marshal's office by dusk. Keller's superior, a tired man with soft eyes named Cutter, met them at the door. He didn't ask questions. He simply looked Keller up and down, then glanced at Ruth. Gaunt, silent, hair matted with soil. "I'll need a full report," Cutter said. Keller didn't blink. "You won't believe it." "I don't have to," Cutter replied. "Just tell it clean." He tried. That night, he sat at his desk with a lantern flickering low, writing until his hand cramped. Names, places, the ritual, the pit, the stool with his name on it. He included everything except the song. He couldn't write the song. Every time he tried, the tune came back to him in pieces, hiding in the corners of silence. So he left it blank. The report went up the chain, and nothing happened. No inquiry, no visit from the governor, no arrests. The chapel in Fletcher's Cross wasn't even listed on the county register. It was like it had never existed. Ruth stayed in town under the name Clara Day. She worked mornings at the baker's and spent evenings on the porch of the widow Lassiter, humming nonsense songs to herself and never looking at reflections. Keller visited her twice. The first time she refused to speak. The second, she gave him something. A letter. Folded, sealed with wax, no name on the front. "Found it in my coat the day after," she said. "It wasn't mine, but I think you were meant to read it." He took it back to his office, sat down, and opened it. The paper was old, older than anything that should have survived underground. The ink was dark red, not quite rust, not quite blood. There were only 4 sentences. "The fold is not a place, it is a question. You sang it when no one answered. You buried it and called it memory. But memory is the altar." There was no signature. He folded the letter and tucked it behind the lining of his coat. That night, he drank. More than usual. He saw his brother in the bottom of the glass, smiling, mouth full of dirt, singing softly. The next morning, he went to the church archives. He spent hours digging through death records, land titles, anything connected to Fletcher's Cross. There were only 6 death certificates for the past 10 years, all infants. No mention of Elias, no record of the family that had supposedly owned the chapel grounds. The deeds stopped in 1819. The town had been erased. Not forgotten, removed. He found a single article from 1821, printed in a local broadsheet. Town of Fletcher's Cross declared spiritually unfit by traveling revivalist. Locals refused to leave, citing visions. Reverend Edgar Elias establishes Fold of Deliverance Chapel on the edge of Willow Creek. That was all. No follow-up, no obituary, no fire report. Keller went home and packed his bags. He left town the next morning. Ruth didn't stop him. He rode west for 2 weeks, taking no notes, making no stops in towns that had churches more than a decade old. He slept with a lantern burning and a pistol under his pillow. On the 15th night, he stopped near an abandoned cabin along the river. It was cold but quiet. For the first time since the pit, he heard no song. He dared to sleep. In the early hours, just before dawn, he awoke to the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. He grabbed his pistol, waited. No knock, no voice, just the sound of pacing, slow, patient, as though the person outside knew he was listening and didn't care. He flung open the door, gun raised. Nothing. Just trees, mist, and a chair. Old, wooden, the kind you'd find in a chapel or schoolhouse. It sat at the edge of the fire pit, empty, waiting. He walked toward it. On the seat, carved into the wood in raw, rough strokes, was a phrase. You heard the song. You carry it now. He kicked the chair into the fire pit and lit a match. It burned quickly. No screams, no ash floating upward into cymbals. Just wood, blackened and silent. But all that night, as he drifted in and out of sleep, he dreamed of that stool by the water. Still empty. Still bearing his name. Still singing. Only this time the voice wasn't a stranger's. It was his. Back in town, Ruth woke up screaming. She didn't remember the dream, only the feeling. Dirt in her mouth, thread in her teeth. She didn't sleep the rest of the week. When she finally braved a glance into the bakery's window, she didn't see herself. She saw Keller, sitting on the 7th stool, watching her, mouth closed, eyes wide, waiting. The wind carried the old melody down the street, brushing against the shutters, tickling the bells above the bakery door. The townsfolk ignored it. They always did. They knew not to follow the sound. Because there was one rule in Fletcher's Cross that no one ever broke. Do not sit when the stool is empty. The autumn rain fell hard across the red clay hills of Alabama, turning every path to sludge and every prayer to steam in the mouth. At the edge of the forgotten field, once called Fletcher's Cross, nothing remained of the chapel. Not the whitewashed walls, not the bell tower, not even the roots where the altar once stood. Just an emptiness, flat, silent, and dry, no matter how hard it rained. But something lingered. Sheriff Henry Albright had never believed the rumors. He was a man of ledgers and timetables, of census counts and tax records. So when he rode out to survey the parcel for a logging company, he brought a pistol, yes, but he brought it for bears. The townsfolk warned him. "It ain't good ground," the blacksmith said. "Nothing grows there," whispered the mayor's wife. Albright nodded, smiled, made polite notes, and packed his lunch like he was going fishing. He arrived just after noon, dismounted, and surveyed the land. It was quiet, dead quiet. No wind, no birds, no movement in the tree line. The map said there should be an old creek nearby, but when he went to look, he found only a trench, dry and cracked. No frogs, no mud. He turned back toward the field. There, at the center, sat a chair. Just one. Not rotted, not old, not even dirty. It looked as though someone had carried it there that morning and wiped it clean with a cloth. He approached slowly. There was no breeze, but his coat fluttered anyway. A presence. That was the only word he could later give it. Like someone had exhaled behind him but was still waiting to inhale. He reached the chair. Carved into the seat was a name: Henry Albright. He stared at it for a long time, blinking against the rain that didn't touch the wood. Then, from somewhere behind his ribcage, something moved. Not a thought. A memory, not his, a church, a choir, a girl in white singing with black thread in her mouth. And beneath them all, a pool of still water. He stumbled back, breath caught like a fishhook in his throat. He had never been here before. He had never seen these visions. And yet, he remembered. He fled. Didn't stop until he reached town, where he burst into the tavern and ordered 2 bourbons. Neat. By nightfall, he'd resigned. 2 weeks later, the field was purchased by a company that planned to build a textile mill. They lasted 6 days. On the 7th, their surveyor went missing. On the 8th, so did their engineer. By the 9th, the foundation crew had abandoned their equipment and walked barefoot back to town, refusing to speak a word. When pressed, one of them whispered, "It sings." That was enough. The land was condemned. No formal explanation, no newspaper article, just a line on a map blacked out with ink and marked unsuitable. Years passed. The town forgot, but not completely. Every now and then, someone wandering too far from the road would hear it. Faint, barely audible. A lullaby, drifting across the trees. It was always the same melody, always in the same key, and always when they turned to run, they'd find a chair. Empty. Waiting. The ones who sat never returned. The ones who refused carried something back with them. An image, a phrase, a name not their own. A memory buried like a seed. And when they slept, they dreamed of the pit, of 6 singers, and the 7th still empty. Marshall Keller never returned to public life. His badge was found years later in a shallow creek, rusted but whole. The initials AK were carved into the back, along with a simple message: "I sang." Ruth, who had once been Mary, lived another 10 years. She never married, never left town. She baked every morning and walked every night. But as she aged, her voice changed. It wasn't her own anymore. It shifted from joy to sorrow, from sorrow to something wordless, something ancient. She was found dead on her porch at the age of 38, eyes open, mouth stitched shut. No thread, just the imprint of it, like her body had remembered its shape. The undertaker said it looked peaceful, but the widow Lassiter swore she saw movement in Ruth's throat, like humming. The grave was sealed in a metal coffin by order of the town council. The ground around it remains dead to this day. People speak of curses and madness, of spirits that refuse to die. But those who know better, those who carry the silence inside them, don't call it a curse. They call it a memory, one that waits to be filled, like a song, like a chair. There is no fold in the maps of Alabama now, no chapel listed in any archives, no record of a Reverend Elias or a girl named Ruth who vanished and reappeared. There is only a story whispered in small corners and passed in warnings. If you hear the song, do not sing along. If you see the chair, do not sit down. If the ground calls your name, bury it, or it will bury you. And still the 7th stool remains. Not in any one place, not in any one time. It exists like a shadow behind grief, a reflection behind truth, a rhythm behind silence, a reminder that some prayers are answered by something that never stopped listening. Because the fold is not a place, it's a promise, salvation at any cost.